I have learned over many years that difficult things arrive without announcement. My father's departure arrived on a Tuesday morning when I was 7 years old. He left his keys on the kitchen counter, beside a half-eaten piece of toast, and walked out of our house on Railton Road without so much as pulling the door fully shut behind him. No raised voices, no farewell. Just a draft of cold October air moving through the hallway, and then silence. My mother's hospital letter arrived on a grey Wednesday in March 8 years ago, in a plain NHS envelope with a window front. I stood in the hallway of my flat and opened it with my thumbnail and read it twice before I understood what it was saying. Hi, my beautiful and loyal family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr. Peter Stories. Before we begin, I need a small favor. Some other channels have been copying my stories. If you ever come across my content being reposted anywhere else, please report it and let me know in the comments. Also, don't forget to watch this story until the very end, and after it's over, tell me in the comments what lesson you learned from today's story. Now, without wasting any more time, let's get started. I have always opened difficult posts the same way. Letter opener. Both feet flat on the floor, spine straight. I allow myself no theatre. So when the cream envelope arrived at my desk at Halcourt and Vane Architects on Mount Street on a Tuesday morning in late October, I opened it the same way I open everything. My desk faces the window. From where I sit, I can see the terracotta ornamentation along the upper stories of the buildings opposite, the kind of Victorian craftsmanship that most people walk beneath every day without ever looking up to find it. I have always looked up. That tendency to notice what others overlook is, I suppose, what makes me a competent architect. It is also what makes certain moments in my life impossible to escape cleanly. The envelope was ivory. The paper inside was heavy stock, the kind that costs money precisely to communicate that money is not a concern. The typeface was charcoal, understated, considered. I read the two names printed at the top, Crispin James Harwood and Lavette Joy Daly. I set the card down on the edge of my drawing board. I looked at it for a moment, the way I look at a structural calculation I suspect contains an error, with precision, without panic, searching for the exact location of the fault. Then I picked up my pen and returned to the hotel renovation drawings due to the client by Thursday. I worked until 6 o'clock. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I did not walk to the window and stare out at Mount Street with my hand pressed to my chest in the manner of a woman in a film. I finished the third revision of the Marylebone elevations, filed them in the correct folder on my desktop, turned off my lamp, collected my coat from the rack by the door, and took the lift down to the street. The evening air on Mount Street was cold and smelled faintly of exhaust and the last of the day's rain on warm stone. I walked to Bond Street Station, took the Central Line one stop to Oxford Circus, changed to the Victoria Line, and rode it south all the way to Brixton. I let myself into my flat on Effra Road at 7:30. I sat down in the armchair by the window, the one that faces the street, and I did not turn on the lights. I sat in the dark for a long time. The room was not quiet. Effra Road at that hour carries the sound of buses, of voices, of someone's music drifting from an upstairs window 3 doors down. The world outside continued with complete indifference, as it always does. I thought about what the invitation meant. Crispin and I had been together for 3 years, engaged for 1. 8 months ago, I had taken the ring from my finger and placed it on the kitchen table between us without a word, because I had understood by then that asking him to explain himself would produce only the performance of an explanation, and I had too much self-respect to sit through that. I had stood up, collected my bag, and left his flat in Marylebone for the last time. I had believed, in the months that followed, that I had managed it, that I had processed the end of something I had built carefully and trusted completely. I had worked longer hours. I had taken a commission I would previously have declined. I had been to the theatre twice with a colleague from the firm, and to a dinner at the Connaught with a client, and to a friend's birthday in Clapham where nobody asked me difficult questions. The invitation, sitting now on the arm of the chair beside me in the dark, told me clearly that I had processed nothing. I had simply relocated the wound to somewhere less visible and convinced myself that relocation was the same as healing. Alongℹ, my sister. I said her name aloud in the dark flat, not with anger. Anger would have been too clean, too simple for what I felt. What I felt was something more complicated and more exhausting than anger. It was the particular weariness that comes from being unsurprised. She was 6 years younger than me. She had grown up in my shadow so consistently that she had come to regard my shadow as something I cast deliberately, as a kind of aggression. She had wanted things I had, not because she wanted those specific things, but because they were mine. That wanting had begun long before Crispin entered either of our lives. He was simply the most recent object of it. I understood this about my sister. Understanding it did not make it bearable. I reached out and picked the invitation up. In the dark I couldn't read it, but I held it, running my thumb along the embossed edge. There is a choice that presents itself to a woman in my position. She can absent herself. She can send her regrets in a crisp card with correct punctuation and a plausible excuse, and allow the wedding to proceed without her witness. Many people would consider that the dignified option. Many people would call it grace. I have never in my life confused absence with dignity. If I did not attend that wedding, my absence would become the story. Crispin and Alongℹ would stand at the altar of St. Paul's Church in Knightsbridge, and every person in that building would picture me. Not present, not composed, not looking them in the eye, but somewhere small and diminished, unable to face what had been done. My absence would be read as devastation, and they would be right to read it that way, which was precisely why I could not permit it. I would attend. I would wear something they would remember for the wrong reasons, not grief, not spectacle, but the quiet, unignorable authority of a woman who has not been broken by what was done to her. I would sit in that church, and I would hold myself the way my mother taught me to hold myself in rooms that were not built for people like us. Completely upright, entirely present, costing them the satisfaction of my collapse. I set the invitation down again on the arm of the chair. I said it quietly, to the empty room and the noise of Ephra Road outside and the dark that offered no argument. You chose the wrong sister, but you will never see my face know that. I sat for another few minutes. Then I stood, turned on the lamp, went to the kitchen, and made myself a cup of tea. I had a hotel in Marylebone to finish by Thursday. I had a community housing proposal in Peckham to review by the end of the week. I had a life I had built from nothing and intended to continue building. Whatever Crispin Harwood and my sister had constructed in my absence was their business. I would not allow it to interrupt mine. Chapter 2. Railton Road. I took the Victoria line to Brixton on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days after the envelope arrived. I did not tell anyone I was going. I did not phone ahead. In 9 years of living 10 minutes from my mother's house, I have never once called before coming. Dorothea Daly does not require notice. She requires only that you arrive, sit at her kitchen table, and accept whatever she places in front of you without complaint. Tea, usually. Silence, occasionally. Truth, when she is ready to offer it, which is never on your schedule and always on hers. I walked from Brixton Station up Brixton Road and turned onto Railton Road just before 3 o'clock. The street looked the way it always looks in October, the plane trees stripped back to their pale articulated branches, the Victorian terraces standing in their rows, with the particular stubbornness of buildings that have outlasted everything thrown at them. Railton Road has seen things that would have unmade a lesser street. It has been the site of uprising and resistance and loss, and an entire generation of people fighting simply to be regarded as human in a city that was not always certain they deserved to be. The history lives in the pavement. You feel it if you were raised here. You feel it even when nothing about the street's current quietness. The timber planters, the parked bicycles, the cat watching from a windowsill at number 43 suggests anything other than an ordinary Thursday afternoon in South London. My mother's house is a two-story Victorian terrace with a blue front door that has needed repainting since 2018. I have offered to pay for it 6 times. 6 times Dorothea has declined. There is a conversation embedded in that refusal that neither of us has ever spoken aloud, because we are, both of us, women who prefer to leave certain conversations in the walls where they live rather than bring them into the light where they become undeniable. I knocked. She opened the door before the second knock, which meant she had seen me coming from the front window. She looked at my face and she said nothing. She stepped back to let me in. The house smells the way it has always smelled, of the particular cleaning product my mother has used on her floors for 30 years, of the faint ghost of the Jamaican food that materializes in this kitchen several times a week, of something older and less definable that I associate with childhood and with safety, and with the complicated love of a woman who gave me everything she had and some things she didn't. I sat down at the kitchen table. The table is pine. It has a ring mark on the left-hand side from a mug placed without a coaster sometime in the mid-90s. I used to rest my homework books on this table. I used to sit here at 11 years old and practice my geometry while my mother washed dishes with her back to me, and Radio 4 played at low volume and the street outside made its ordinary noise. I was good at geometry. I understood, even then, that everything had a structure you could learn to read if you were patient enough to look at it long enough. Dorothea filled the kettle without asking whether I wanted tea. In this kitchen, tea is not a question. It is a given. She set a mug in front of me and sat down across the table and folded her hands together on the surface in front of her, the way she folds them in church. I told her I had received the invitation. She did not look surprised. She looked at her hands. I watched her watching her hands, and I understood immediately. She had known about this wedding before I did. Not for days, for longer than that. I asked her how long she had known. She said, 3 months. I sat with that number. 3 months is a season. 3 months is the entire length of a British summer. 3 months is 90 days, during which my mother had sat across from me at this table on at least 4 separate occasions. For Sunday dinner, for my birthday in August, for an ordinary Wednesday visit in September, and had looked at me and had said nothing. I did not shout. I have never once raised my voice at my mother. It is not restraint that stops me. It is the knowledge that shouting at Dorothea daily would be like shouting at a stone wall. Not because she is unfeeling, but because she is a woman who has long since decided that the things she cannot answer should simply not be raised, and no volume on my part will alter that philosophy. I asked her instead why she had not told me. She said, I didn't want to cause you pain before I had to. I looked at her across the table, at the hands folded on the pine, at the face that has aged in the 9 years since her hospital letter arrived, and did not age in the ways I expected, not with frailty, but with a kind of compressed heaviness, as though she is carrying weight that has settled permanently into her features. I asked her the question I had come to ask. I asked her whether she knew what Alongℹ had done to end my engagement. The kettle, which I had not noticed was boiling again, clicked off. The sound was very loud in the kitchen. Dorothea was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I knew something wasn't right. I didn't ask too many questions. 6 words that contained everything. I knew something wasn't right. Not, I didn't know. Not, I had no idea. Not, your sister would never. She knew something was wrong. She encountered the wrongness, and she stepped around it with the careful, practiced movement of a woman who has spent a lifetime managing the distance between her 2 daughters by pretending the distance does not exist. I didn't ask too many questions, because the answers would have required her to act, and acting would have required her to choose. And choosing between her daughters, one of whom she had always found easier to love openly, though she would never use those words, was a choice she had never once in 36 years been willing to make. I stood up from the table. I put on my coat. I picked up my bag. I stood for a moment in the kitchen of the house where I had grown up, and I looked at my mother, who was still sitting with her hands folded, and I thought about all the things I could say, and all the things I had been not saying for the entirety of my adult life. I said, "I'll see you soon, Mum." I walked down the hallway. I did not slam the door. I never slam doors. I pulled it closed behind me with the precise and quiet care of a woman who has trained herself to leave without evidence of how much the leaving costs. On the pavement outside, I stood for a moment in the October cold. Railton Road held its Thursday afternoon silence around me. The bare plane trees, the Victorian terraces, the cat still watching from the windowsill at number 43 as though it had not moved an inch in the past hour, and found my internal devastation entirely unremarkable. I started walking toward the station. My phone rang before I reached the end of the road. A number I did not recognize. 11 digits. I answered because I always answer unknown numbers. In my profession, unknown numbers are frequently clients, and I have never yet been in a state of personal crisis sufficient to justify missing a client call. A man's voice, low, measured. The kind of voice produced by an education that costs more per term than my mother earned in a year. Not arrogant with it, just shaped by it, the way certain people are shaped by things they didn't choose and have made their peace with. He said, "Seraphine, it's Aldous Pemberton. I think we need to speak before Saturday." I stopped walking. The plane trees stood above me. The sky over Brixton was the particular flat grey of a London October afternoon that has decided against rain but has not yet committed to anything better. I said, "How did you get this number?" He said, "Crispin had it in his phone for 3 years. I memorized it a long time ago." I stood on the pavement on Railton Road, and I said nothing for a moment that stretched longer than was comfortable for either of us. Then I said, "I'm listening." Chapter 3. The man I did not see. I need to tell you about a dinner party before I tell you about the phone call. 4 years ago, on a Friday evening in November, Crispin brought me to a private dinner at a house in Eaton Square, Belgravia. We had been together for 4 months. I was still in the early, careful stage of learning how to exist inside his world, the world of Eton friendships and inherited surnames and dinner parties in Belgravia townhouses where the wine arrives without a label because everyone present already knows what it is and where it came from. I was not uncomfortable. I want to be precise about that. I was not the wide-eyed woman from Brixton, overwhelmed by the grandeur of it all. I was 32 years old, a senior associate at one of Mayfair's more respected architectural practices, and I had been sitting in rooms like that one, rooms I was not designed for, rooms that had not been designed for me, for long enough that I had learned the particular composure those rooms require. You sit straight. You listen more than you speak. You never let them see you calculating the distance between where you came from and where you are sitting. What I was that evening was watchful. There were 8 people at the table, a property developer and his wife, whose names I have since forgotten, a woman who worked in foreign policy and spoke with the clipped authority of someone accustomed to being the most informed person in any given room, a man who restored medieval manuscripts and said almost nothing for the first 2 courses, but became unexpectedly riveting on the subject of 15th century Flemish illumination once the main course arrived. Crispin, beside me, performing the version of himself that came out at dinners like this, expansive, easy, fluent in the language of people who have never once in their lives worried about money, and at the far end of the table, in a dark suit and with a glass of red wine he barely touched all evening, Aldous Pemberton. Crispin had mentioned him. Old friend from Eton, the Pemberton Group, infrastructure, private equity, logistics, the kind of empire that operates so far above the level at which ordinary people encounter commerce that most people have never heard of it, despite the fact that it underpins, in one form or another, a significant portion of what moves through this country's ports and roads and systems every single day. Worth, at that time, somewhere in the region of £4 billion, though Crispin mentioned this the way you mention the weather, as context, not as the point. He was tall, quieter than anyone else at the table, not shy. I was attentive enough to the distinction to be certain of it. He was contained. There is a specific quality of stillness in certain people that reads not as passivity, but as density, as though they are thinking more than they are saying, and what they are thinking is considerably more interesting than the conversation currently occupying the room. He had that quality in abundance. We were introduced before dinner, briefly, in the way people are introduced at gatherings like that. First name, brief context, handshake, and then the tide of the room pulls you apart before anything of substance can be said. Over dinner, I spoke mostly to the foreign policy woman and to the medieval manuscript restorer, whose name was Gerald, and who I found genuinely captivating once he located his conversational register. At some point in the second hour of the evening, I found myself in a tangential exchange about architecture and the South Bank, and the buildings I loved most in that part of the city. I was not speaking to anyone in particular. I was speaking to the table, the way one does at a certain point in an evening, when the wine has loosened the structure of individual conversations into something more collective. I said, and I remember this with some clarity, because I remember most things I say about buildings, that the structure I loved most on the South Bank was not the Tate Modern, which is the expected answer, but the concrete walkway of the Queen Elizabeth Hall podium, the way it engages with the river, the way it refuses to be decorative, the way it says with complete confidence that utility and beauty are not enemies. Aldous Pemberton, from the far end of the table, looked up. He did not say anything. He looked at me for 2 or 3 seconds with an expression I was unable to read precisely. Not surprise, not disagreement, but something more like recognition, as though I had said something that confirmed a private thought he had been carrying for some time. Then the conversation moved on, and I looked away. Later in the evening, during a lull between courses, he refilled my wine glass. He was passing with the bottle, and he paused beside me and topped up my glass without making it an occasion. No flourish, no eye contact held a beat too long, no performance of attentiveness. Just a quiet, practical courtesy extended and then retracted without ceremony. I thanked him. He nodded once. That was the full extent of our exchange that evening. 3 weeks later, I was at Crispin's flat in Marylebone, a first-floor apartment on Devonshire Place, high ceilings, cornicing, the kind of building that was constructed to last several centuries and is proceeding accordingly, and there was an architecture journal on the coffee table. I picked it up because I pick up architecture journals. The cover feature was a long piece on the Queen Elizabeth Hall podium, its history, its engineering, its place in the brutalist canon, the ongoing tension between its advocates and those who would prefer something more conventionally beautiful in its place. I asked Crispin where the journal had come from. He said Aldous had sent it round. I set it back on the table and thought nothing further of it. I'm telling you this now because I need you to understand something about the version of myself that existed for the 3 years that followed. I was not paying attention to Aldous Pemberton, not because he was unremarkable. I knew, in the abstract way you know things about people who occupy the periphery of your life, that he was neither unremarkable nor unworthy of attention. But he was Crispin's friend. He existed in my mental architecture of those years as a feature of Crispin's world rather than as a person in his own right. I saw him at gatherings. We spoke on perhaps a dozen occasions over 3 years, at dinners, at 2 charity functions, once at a gallery opening in St. James's, where he appeared briefly, said something dry and accurate about the paintings, and left before most people had arrived. I never looked at him the way he had apparently been looking at me. I did not know that yet. I was still on Railton Road, standing beneath the October plane trees with his voice in my ear when I began to understand it. On the phone, he told me that he had been at Crispin's flat in Marylebone on the evening Alongℹ arrived. He had been there for a drink. The two of them had a loose arrangement, a standing Thursday evening drink that had persisted since their Eton years. He had been in the sitting room when the intercom sounded. He had seen Alongℹ in the hallway when Crispin buzzed her up. He had understood, in the particular way he understands things, quickly, without requiring them to be explained in full, what the energy in that flat was moving toward. He had left before anything happened. He had called Crispin the following morning and told him in plain language that he was making the worst decision available to him. Crispin had said, "It's already done." Aldous had not called me. He told me this on the phone without evasion. He said he had thought about calling me that night and had decided against it. I asked him why. He was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, just considering. Then he said, "Because if I had called you, it would not have been to warn you. It would have been for a reason I had no right to act on at that time, and using your pain as a doorway to something I wanted for myself felt like the worst possible version of who I intended to be." I stood very still on Railton Road. I said, "What reason?" He said, "I think you already know the answer to that." I did not answer. The flat October light sat on the terraces around me, and I said nothing for long enough that a woman pushing a pram past me on the pavement glanced over with mild concern. Then I said, "I'll think about what you've said." I ended the call. I walked the rest of the way to Brixton Station and took the Victoria Line north and sat in my flat on Alongℹ Road and opened my laptop and searched his name. The results filled the screen. Pemberton Group, Infrastructure, Private Equity, Port Logistics, £4.1 billion, a brief, unrevealing profile in the Financial Times from 2 years ago, almost no photographs. Then one image, a charity gala 3 years ago. Black tie, Aldous standing beside Crispin, both of them in the foreground. And in the background, slightly out of frame, almost missed, a woman in a dark dress with her head tilted back in laughter, unaware she was being captured by the camera. That woman was me. Aldous was not looking at Crispin. He was not looking at the camera. He was not looking at anything else in that room. He was looking at me. He had been looking at me for 4 years. And I had spent 4 years looking at everything else. I closed the laptop. I sat in the quiet of my flat and I thought about a wine glass, refilled without ceremony, and a journal that arrived on a coffee table without explanation, and a man at the end of a dinner table who looked up when I spoke about a concrete walkway on the South Bank, as though I had said something he had been waiting a long time to hear someone say. I thought about all the things that had been present in my life without my ever having looked up to find them. Chapter 4. St. Paul's, Knightsbridge. I bought the dress on the Wednesday before the wedding. Not because I had left it late. I had known what I was going to wear in the broad sense since the evening I sat in the dark on Alongℹ Road and made my decision. I had simply needed 2 weeks to find the precise version of it. The color had to be exact. The cut had to say the right things without saying them loudly. I was not dressing for a wedding. I was dressing for a room full of people who would be watching me from the moment I walked through the door, and I intended to give them something worth looking at that was entirely on my own terms. I found it in a small boutique on Motcombe Street in Belgravia, a dress the color of deep burgundy, almost oxblood in certain lights, with a structured bodice and a skirt that fell cleanly to the knee. Understated, precise. The kind of garment that does not shout, but does not apologize either. I tried it on once, looked at myself in the mirror for 10 seconds, and bought it without deliberation. I was not wearing black. Black is the color of mourning, and I was not mourning. I was attending. On Saturday morning, I woke at 6:30. The light coming through the curtains on Ephra Road was the thin, grey-white light of a London October morning that has not yet committed to anything. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and drank it slowly, and watched the street below begin its gradual Saturday reanimation. A man walking a dog, the colour of autumn leaves. A woman in a yellow coat moving briskly toward the bus stop. A delivery van reversing with its warning beep, cutting through the quiet at irregular intervals. I showered, I dressed. I sat at the mirror in my bedroom and did my makeup with the same methodical attention I bring to technical drawings. Each element considered, nothing excessive, the finished result exactly what I intended, and nothing it did not intend to be. I looked at myself for a moment when I was done. Then I picked up my coat and my bag, and I left the flat. I took the Victoria line north from Brixton, changed at Victoria Station, and walked the remainder of the distance to Wilton Place. The church sits just behind the convergence of Knightsbridge and Belgrave Place, tucked into a pocket of the city that feels, despite its proximity to the roar of Knightsbridge proper, like a different register entirely. Quiet streets, the Berkeley Hotel across the way with its restrained Georgian facade, mature trees that have been standing long enough to have opinions about the neighbourhood. St. Paul's Church from the outside is not what people imagine when they hear the name. There are no grand columns, no dome, no sweeping ceremonial steps. It is a brick building with a tall clock tower and an exterior that gives almost nothing away, plain, almost reticent, as though it has learned over its long life that what happens inside it requires no advertisement. I arrived at 12:20. The pavement outside the church was busy in the particular way of wedding pavements, guests arriving in clusters, a photographer moving between them, the low collective murmur of people performing the social rituals that weddings demand. I saw 3 people I recognized. 2 of them were Crispin's colleagues. One was a woman I had met at a dinner in Chelsea 2 years ago, whose name I remembered, and whose expression, when she saw me, shifted through 3 distinct emotions in approximately 2 seconds. I gave her a composed smile and walked past. I went inside. The interior of St. Paul's is everything the exterior withholds. The nave is rich with tiled panels along the walls depicting scenes I recognized from years of looking at ecclesiastical architecture, deep greens and blues, and the warm reddish-brown of Victorian ceramic, the colors still vivid after more than 150 years. The stained glass reads almost luminous from the inside because the church is kept deliberately dim, the artificial lighting low, so that whatever light enters through the windows arrives with the concentrated intensity of something curated rather than incidental. The organ pipes rise at the east end, framed by a reredos of carved stone. The whole interior has the quality of a space that has been thinking very seriously about beauty for a very long time. I found a seat in the 3rd row on the guest side. I set my bag on my lap. I folded my hands over it. I looked at the altar flowers, cream and white, arranged with the expensive restraint of someone who has been told that understatement is the most sophisticated form of extravagance. And I breathed. The church filled around me. I did not turn to watch it fill. I kept my eyes forward. The organ began at 12 o'clock precisely. The congregation rose. I rose with it. I did not turn to watch Livette walk in. I made that decision consciously and deliberately. I would see her at the altar when the time came. I did not need to watch her process down the aisle. There is a difference between attending and performing attendance, and I was attending, present, composed, costing them nothing. I watched Crispin instead. He was standing at the altar in a charcoal morning suit, flanked by his best man, a man I did not know, someone from his professional life, not Aldous. I noticed that immediately. Aldous was not at the altar. I filed this information away without yet understanding why it mattered. Crispin at the altar was a man I had known for 3 years. I had been engaged to him. I had slept beside him. I had met his mother in her house in Wiltshire and eaten Sunday lunch at her table and submitted to her examination with the patience of a woman who understood exactly what was being assessed and had decided to pass the test on her own terms rather than on the assessor's. I had believed for 1 year out of the 3 that he was the person I would build the second half of my life alongside. I watched him standing at that altar, and I looked for the fault line the way I always look for fault lines, carefully, without emotion, seeking only information. He was nervous. His right hand moved to his jacket pocket and back again twice before the music changed register. He scanned the congregation once, quickly, the way a man does when he is looking for something specific and is not certain he wants to find it. His eyes reached the 3rd row. They found me. We looked at each other across the length of that church for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is not a long time. It is long enough. He looked away first. He has always, in every situation that required courage, looked away first. That was the thing I had understood too late about Crispin Harwood. Not that he was a cruel man, but that he was a man constitutionally incapable of holding his nerve when holding it cost him something. He had not destroyed my engagement out of malice. He had destroyed it because Alongℹ had presented him with a door marked exit and he had lacked the character to walk past it. Looking away first, at that altar, in that church, was the most honest thing he had done in 3 years. I returned my gaze to the altar flowers. I breathed. I held myself completely upright in the 3rd row, and I was entirely, unassailably present. The ceremony proceeded. Vows were spoken in the correct order. Rings were placed on the correct fingers. The vicar's voice moved through the ancient language of the service with the practiced fluency of a man who has conducted hundreds of these ceremonies and believes in the weight of every word, which I found, unexpectedly, moving, not for what the words meant in relation to Crispin and Alongℹ, but for what they meant in the abstract. The language of commitment is beautiful regardless of the people speaking it. I have always been able to separate the vessel from the content. At the moment the vicar said, "You may kiss the bride," a presence settled into the empty space at the end of my pew. He did not announce himself. He did not touch me. He simply sat, close enough that the sleeve of his jacket rested against my arm with the lightest possible pressure. And he faced forward, and he was still in the way he is always still, and he bore witness to the final seconds of that ceremony beside me, as though he had decided some time ago that this was where he was going to be at this moment, and had simply arrived at the appointed time. I did not turn to look at him. I did not need to. For the first time since I had walked through the doors of St. Paul's Church on Wilton Place, I exhaled, fully, a breath that had apparently been waiting some considerable time for permission to leave my body. The congregation rose around us. I stood with it. Aldous stood beside me. We did not look at each other in the immediate noise and movement of the recessional. Then, as the congregation began filing toward the doors and the organ swelled to fill the vaulted space above us, he leaned slightly toward me and spoke quietly enough that only I could hear. He said, "You did not have to come today. The fact that you did says everything about who you are, and what she did says everything about who she is not." I said nothing, but I did not look away. Chapter 5. The reception. The venue was a converted Georgian townhouse on Royal Hospital Road in Chelsea. I had walked past this building before, on a Sunday afternoon 2 years ago, with Crispin, returning from a lunch near Sloane Square. He had pointed it out, said a client had hired it for a corporate event. I had looked at the facade and assessed it the way I assess all buildings, noting the proportions of the windows, the original brickwork that had been cleaned but not over-restored, the ironwork balustrade above the entrance that was period correct and therefore almost certainly original. I had thought, good bones. Someone made sensible decisions about this building. I had not imagined I would one day walk into it for this reason. I arrived with the main flow of guests, which was intentional. I did not want to be the first person in the room, standing alone with a glass of champagne while the space filled around me. Neither did I want to arrive late and generate the particular attention that lateness attracts. I arrived in the middle, which is where I have always been most comfortable. Present without being conspicuous, visible without being theatrical. The interior had been dressed for the occasion with the unstudied extravagance that costs more than studied extravagance and is designed to look as though no cost was involved at all. Enormous arrangements of white flowers, peonies I thought, and something with trailing greenery I could not immediately name, stood on pedestals at intervals along the main reception room. A string quartet played near the far windows overlooking the garden. The champagne was very cold and arrived in very thin glasses, and the waiting staff moved through the room with the silent, practiced efficiency of people trained to be invisible. I took a glass. I did not drink immediately. I held it, and I moved through the room. I know how to move through a room like that one. I have been doing it for 12 years. The architectural firms, the client dinners, the gallery openings, the charity functions, the professional gatherings where I was consistently the only black woman present, and had learned out of sheer necessity to occupy those spaces without apology and without the performance of comfort I did not always feel. You develop a fluency, a way of making yourself legible to the room on your own terms rather than on the terms the room would prefer to impose. I spoke to a woman who had been at university with Crispin and who managed to conduct an entire 5-minute conversation with me while her eyes broadcast something she was too well-bred to say aloud. I spoke to a man who identified himself as Crispin's second cousin and who asked me what I did and, when I told him, said, "Architecture. How interesting," in the tone people use when they mean something other than what they are saying. I smiled at both of them with complete serenity and moved on. Aldous was across the room. I was aware of him the way you are aware of a structural element in a building, not always looking at it directly, but always conscious of where it is and what it is doing. He was speaking to a man I did not recognize, his posture easy, his attention apparently complete. He did not look across the room at me. I found to my own mild irritation that I was aware of this, of the deliberate quality of his not looking, which was not the same as indifference. The string quartet finished a piece and began another. The room continued its performance of celebration. Then the speeches began. The best man spoke first, the man from Crispin's professional life, whose name I had not caught. He was competent, if unremarkable. He told a story about a skiing trip. He made a joke about Crispin's punctuality that landed adequately. He raised his glass with the correct timing and sat down. Then Levette's maid of honor stood up. Her name was Suki. She had grown up 3 streets from us in Brixton. She and Levette had been inseparable from the age of 11, a friendship forged in the particular crucible of 2 girls who had decided early that the world was more manageable in pairs. I had known Suki for 20 years. I had watched her grow from a bright, sharp-tongued girl into a bright, sharp-tongued woman, and I had always understood that her loyalty to Levette was total and unconditional, and operated, when necessary, without reference to fairness. She was good at speeches. I will give her that. She spoke warmly, and she spoke wittily, and she spoke with the fluency of a woman who had been composing this particular speech in her head for considerably longer than the engagement had existed. She spoke about love being patient. She spoke about love finding its way to the people it was always intended for, even when the path was complicated. She spoke with a smile that was perfectly calibrated to read as general sentiment from most angles in the room, about doors that close so that the correct doors can open. She looked at me once, briefly, directly, deliberately. The look lasted less than a second. It was enough. I held my champagne glass, and I kept my expression at precisely the temperature it had been before she looked at me, and I did not give her the satisfaction of a single alteration. but I felt the room register it. The tiny collective adjustment of a gathering that has understood something just happened without being able to specify what or wanting to be caught specifying it. Then Livette stood up. My sister was in white, which was her right, and she was beautiful, which was not in question, and she was holding her champagne glass with the particular grip of a woman who is performing confidence rather than feeling it, which I noticed because I have spent a lifetime learning the difference between the two. She spoke about being happy. She spoke about finally, and she used that word finally with a weight she intended me to feel, having the life she had always dreamed of. And she looked at me, not briefly, not with the deniable glance Suki had offered. She looked at me across the reception room of that Georgian townhouse on Royal Hospital Road for long enough that no one in the immediate vicinity could have mistaken it for anything other than what it was. It was a declaration. It was dressed in the language of a toast, raised glass, softened vowels, the ceremonial register of a wedding speech. But it was a declaration of victory, made directly, personally, to the only person in that room who would understand its full dimensions. I did not move. I did not look away. I did not look down. I did not shift my weight or touch my face, or allow a single muscle in my expression to alter its position. I was marble. I have been marble before. I have sat in rooms where I was being assessed and dismissed simultaneously, where I was being smiled at by people who were certain I did not belong, where I was being required to perform gratitude for the privilege of my own presence. I know how to be marble. The marbleness is real, not a performance of composure, but composure itself, earned through years of practice in exactly this kind of room. But marble is not nothing. Marble is something immense and dense that has been subjected to an immense and prolonged pressure, and I felt every pound of it. The applause for Livette's speech rose around me, and then, before it had fully settled, before the room had fully returned to its ordinary register, a figure stood up from a table to my left. Aldous did not raise his hand for attention. He did not wait to be introduced or acknowledged. He simply stood, and the quality of his stillness at full height was such that the room oriented toward him without being asked to. He walked to where the microphone stood. A ripple moved through the nearest tables. He was not on the order of service. Everyone present knew that, and in a room full of people who understood the protocols of occasions like this, a deviation from the order of service carries a specific gravity. He took the microphone. He looked at the room for a moment. Then he spoke. He toasted the couple first. Correctly, graciously, briefly. He said the things that the occasion required, and he said them with a sincerity that was entirely convincing because I understood this about him by now. He was not a man who said things he did not mean. Even in a situation like this one, the courtesy was real. Then he paused. He said, "I would also like to raise a glass, if I may, to someone else in this room." The silence that followed had a texture to it. He said, "To the finest architect I have the privilege of knowing. A woman who was raised on a street in Brixton by a mother who worked through the night so that her daughter could have a different kind of morning. A woman who built her career and her life and her extraordinary competence from nothing but her own considerable intelligence and her absolute refusal to be diminished by anyone or anything. Seraphine Daly, I am very glad you are here today." The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something true has been introduced into a space designed for the management of truth. Livette's smile remained on her face. It did not move. It did not reach anything above her cheekbones. Crispin looked at his champagne glass with the focused attention of a man reading something very important in the bubbles. I looked at Aldous across the room. He looked back at me with the straightforward, uncomplicated steadiness of a man who has decided something and is at complete peace with his decision. He began to walk back toward his table. Crispin stepped into his path. I was not close enough to hear the exact words. I saw Crispin's jaw tighten. I saw him say something in a low voice, with the compressed energy of a man attempting to conduct a confrontation while maintaining the appearance of a conversation. Aldous did not stop walking. He said something, 4 or 5 words, delivered without heat or volume, and continued past Crispin without altering his pace by a single step. Later, he would tell me what he said. He said, "The truth. You should try it." Chapter 6. Claridge's. He walked me out at 9 o'clock, not dramatically. There was no moment of decision announced to the room, no visible departure that invited commentary. I had been standing near the windows that overlooked the garden at the back of the Royal Hospital Road townhouse, watching the October darkness settle over the Chelsea rooftops, when he appeared beside me with his jacket buttoned and a look that asked a question without requiring words to ask it. I set my barely touched champagne glass on the nearest surface and collected my coat from the cloakroom, and we walked out of the front door onto Royal Hospital Road together, and the cold night air of Chelsea received us without ceremony. We did not discuss where we were going. We simply walked north. He knew Mount Street, and I knew Belgravia, and between us we knew every turning in that part of the city well enough to navigate it in any direction without consultation. We walked in silence for the first few minutes, not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that two people generate when they are both thinking carefully and have enough respect for each other to refrain from filling the space with noise before the thinking is complete. We turned onto Brook Street and arrived at the entrance to Claridge's at 9:15. I had walked past Claridge's more times than I could count. In 12 years of working in Mayfair, I had attended one client lunch in the main restaurant and one drinks function in a private room on an upper floor. The building's Art Deco facade on Brook Street has always struck me as one of the more honest pieces of architecture in this part of London, a building that knows exactly what it is and makes no attempt to be anything else, which is a quality I find considerably more appealing than the false modesty of ostentation dressed as restraint. Aldous held the door. We went through the main lobby with its black and white marble floor and the immense floral arrangement that Claridge's maintains at the center of it with the consistency of a civic institution, and he led me to the fumoir. The door to the fumoir is a narrow Art Deco panel of glass and dark metal that requires pulling rather than pushing, and which responds to the incorrect approach with a reprovingly solid resistance. I pulled it correctly. Inside, the room was everything the lobby was not: small, windowless, deeply intimate, lit in a manner that suggested the designers had considered the effect of every individual light source on every surface it would touch. The bar was a horseshoe of black marble. The walls held photographs in the manner of a room that has been curating its own atmosphere for decades. The Lalique glass panels caught the light and distributed it softly, the way water distributes light, so that the whole space seemed to glow from within rather than from above. There were 4 other people in the room, the bar seats perhaps 12 at absolute capacity, and on that Saturday evening in October it was occupied to about a third of that, quiet enough for conversation, full enough not to feel like an interrogation chamber. We sat at the bar. He ordered whiskey. I ordered rum, Jamaican, neat, because there are choices in my life that are not really choices, but rather small, deliberate acts of remembrance. My mother kept a bottle of rum in the kitchen cupboard above the refrigerator for 30 years. She used it medicinally and ceremonially and occasionally on evenings when Railton Road had been particularly loud and her feet particularly tired, simply practically. When I order rum, I am, in some way I have never articulated to anyone, ordering a piece of that kitchen. We sat for a moment with our drinks and the low light and the quiet of the fumoir around us. Then he told me the truth about the night Lovett went to Crispin. He told it without preamble and without the editorial softening that people sometimes apply to difficult information as a courtesy that serves the teller more than the listener. He had been at Crispin's flat on Devonshire Place that Thursday evening, their standing arrangement, a drink that had persisted from their Eton years through university and careers and the various configurations of their adult lives, because some friendships establish their rhythms early and maintain them out of a combination of genuine affection and accumulated habit. He had been in the sitting room when the intercom sounded. He had been present in the hallway for the 30 seconds between Crispin buzzing the door and Livette appearing at the top of the stairs. He told me what he saw in those 30 seconds, not the detail of it, which he spared me, but the energy of it, which he did not. He said, "I understood what I was looking at." I left. I held my rum glass. I did not say anything yet. He said he had called Crispin the following morning at 8 o'clock. He told me the precise words he had used, which were characteristically unambiguous, that Crispin was making a decision he would not be able to reverse, that the woman he was engaged to was a woman of exceptional quality whom he did not deserve to lose, and that whatever had occurred or was occurring with Livette needed to stop immediately and permanently. Crispin had said, "It's already done. I'm sorry, Aldous. It's done." Aldous had ended the call. He had not called me. I set my glass down. I asked him why. I asked it without anger. I was past anger by that point in the evening, past most of the acute emotions and into the quieter, more durable country of simply needing to understand. Why had he not called me? What had stopped him? He had the information. He had my number, as he had told me on the phone on Railton Road, because Crispin had carried it in his phone for 3 years and Aldous had memorized it, which was itself a piece of information I was still absorbing. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his whiskey glass rather than at me, which was the only time that evening I saw him redirect his gaze in a way that suggested the subject beneath the surface, rather than the subject being spoken. Then he said, "I have asked myself that question every day for 8 months, and the honest answer, not the answer I would prefer to give you, but the true one, is that I did not call you to warn you, because warning you was not the only reason I wanted to call. I wanted to call you for myself, because of something I had been carrying for considerably longer than that evening, and using your pain as a justification for acting on that, arriving at your door in the aftermath of what Crispin had done, and presenting myself as the person who cared about you, felt like a manipulation I was not willing to commit, even if it would have been welcome. I did not know if it would have been welcome, and that uncertainty is not an excuse, it is simply the truth." I sat with this for a long time. The fumoir continued its quiet life around us. Somewhere behind me, a soft exchange of laughter. The bartender moved without hurry. The Lalique glass distributed its borrowed light. I asked him what he meant, something he had been carrying. I asked it directly because I am a direct person and because I was tired, by that point in that very long day, of implication. He looked at me then. He said, "I think you know what I mean, Seraphine." I did know. I had known since I had sat in my flat on Effra Road and looked at a photograph taken 3 years ago in which a man was looking at me from across a room while I laughed at something and noticed nothing. But knowing and being ready to receive are not the same thing, and I was not yet ready. So I changed the subject. I asked him about his work. Not the Pemberton Group in the financial press sense. I knew that story. Anyone who had spent time in his world knew that story. But the actual texture of it, what he found meaningful, what he found draining, who he was inside it rather than because of it. He answered with a directness that matched mine. He told me about the infrastructure projects that interested him, the logistic systems, the port operations, the large-scale engineering that moves things and people across the world and operates, for the most part, entirely below the threshold of public attention. He told me he found beauty in systems, in the way that complex, interdependent structures achieve their outcomes through thousands of small, coordinated acts rather than single grand gestures. I thought he would have been a very good architect. I did not say it yet. I filed it. We left Claridge's at 1 o'clock in the morning. The Brook Street air was cold and very still, the kind of stillness that central London achieves only in the deepest part of a Saturday night when the restaurants have closed and the last of the evening traffic has thinned. He put me in a car, a black cab he stepped to the curb to hail, which he paid for by leaning through the window and giving the driver his card details without making an occasion of it. He held the door. I got in. As the cab pulled away, I looked at the street through the rear window, and he was still standing on the pavement outside Claridge's in the cold, watching the cab until it turned the corner onto Davies Street, and he was no longer visible. I faced forward. I rode through the empty, lit corridors of Mayfair and Pimlico and Stockwell, south toward Brixton, and I thought about a man who had loved me in silence for 4 years, because he could not find a version of speaking that did not feel like taking advantage of my pain. The cab turned onto Effra Road. I thought, that is either the most honourable thing I have ever heard, or the saddest. I thought perhaps it was both. Chapter 7. Hampstead Heath. 2 weeks passed. I worked. I drew plans. I attended a client presentation in the city on the Monday after the wedding and delivered it with the fluency that 12 years of practice produces. Clear, authoritative, unhurried. The kind of presentation that makes clients feel they are in capable hands without requiring them to be told so explicitly. The clients were satisfied. My senior partner, a man named Vane, who had been practicing architecture since before I was born and communicated approval exclusively through the absence of criticism, said nothing afterward, which meant it had gone well. I ate dinner at my desk 4 evenings out of 5. I told myself this was because I had a demanding workload, which was true, and not because sitting alone in my flat in the evenings had begun to feel like an activity that required more fortitude than I currently possessed, which was also true. I had not returned calls from Alongℹ, from Crispin, or from my mother. Alongℹ had called 3 times in the week following the wedding. She had left no voicemail on the first 2 occasions and a brief one on the third, her voice carrying the particular register of a woman who wishes to appear conciliatory without offering an actual conciliation. I listened to it once and deleted it. Crispin had sent a text message, 7 words. I hope you are well, Seraphine. Truly. I read it in the architectural firm's kitchen while waiting for the kettle to boil, and I thought 7 words is exactly the correct number for a man who has nothing to say but cannot bear to say nothing. I did not reply. My mother had not called. She had sent, on the Tuesday after the wedding, a text containing only 3 words. I love you, and nothing else. I had read it and set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood for a moment looking at the wall of my flat, and then washed my single dinner plate with great thoroughness and gone to bed. Aldous had not contacted me since the night at Claridge's. I was aware of this. I was aware of it in the way you are aware of the absence of a sound you have grown accustomed to, not loudly, not with drama, but consistently in the background of other things. On the Sunday morning, 2 weeks to the day after the wedding, I woke at 10 minutes past 6. The flat was dark. Effra Road was quiet in the way it is quiet only between 5 and 7 on a Sunday morning. Genuinely, almost rurally quiet, the buses not yet running at full frequency, the street emptied of its weekday purposefulness and not yet filled with its weekend replacements. I lay in the dark for perhaps 10 minutes. Then I got up, made coffee, dressed in the clothes I keep for walking, dark trousers, a warm coat, boots that have covered a considerable number of miles in their existence, and left the flat before 7 o'clock. I took the Victoria line north to Stockwell, changed to the Northern line, and rode it all the way to Hampstead. I have been coming to Hampstead Heath for 7 years. I discovered it in the first winter after I moved to London from the shared house in Streatham, where I lived during my training years, when a colleague mentioned it in the passing way that Londoners mention the Heath, as though it is a piece of common knowledge, something everyone does, obvious and unremarkable. I went on a Saturday in January alone, on a morning of low cloud and absolute cold, and I walked up through the trees to Parliament Hill, and stood at the top, and looked at London spread below me, and felt something ease in my chest that I had not known was tight. I have gone back consistently ever since. The particular bench I favour is on the upper slope of Parliament Hill, set back slightly from the main path, angled to face south over the city. From it, on a clear morning, you can trace the skyline with some precision. The Shard, rising above the southern bank, the cluster of city towers, the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral holding its ground against the encroachment of glass and steel, the London Eye describing its slow and patient arc, if the visibility is sufficient. There is a metal view indicator plaque mounted nearby that names the landmarks and their distances, and I have stood at it enough times to no longer need it. On that Sunday morning in November, the visibility was reasonable. Not the crystalline clarity of a cold, bright day, but a serviceable grey openness that showed the city in its working clothes rather than its best ones, which I have always found more honest and therefore more interesting. I sat on the bench. The heath around me was occupied by its early Sunday congregation, joggers moving along the lower paths, with the focused inward gaze of people engaged in a private negotiation with their own limits. A man at the far edge of the slope, flying a large red kite that pulled against its string with evident conviction. Two women walking briskly with a dog between them, who had his own urgent agenda regarding every piece of ground he passed over. I sat, and I looked at London, and I let it come. I had been preventing it from coming for 2 weeks. I am skilled at prevention. I have had considerable practice, not only in the past 8 months, but across my entire adult life, which has required me to be functional in circumstances that did not invite feeling. The daughter of a woman who worked nights. The first in my family to sit a university entrance examination. The only person in most of the rooms my career has placed me in who looked like me and came from where I came from. Feeling in those contexts was a luxury I could not always afford, and so I developed over years the ability to locate it and store it with some precision until a time and place presented itself for its examination. Parliament Hill on a Sunday morning alone has always been that place. I sat, and I felt the full weight of it. Not only Crispin and Lovett, I had already processed the sharpest edges of that particular wound in the dark of my flat on the evening the invitation arrived. What came now was the larger, older, less clearly defined thing beneath it, the weight of being the daughter who had never quite been enough, not because I had given insufficient evidence of my worthiness, but because the verdict had been reached before the evidence was presented, and no subsequent quantity of achievement had been sufficient to reopen the case. The weight of building myself into someone extraordinary through a combination of intelligence and relentless application, and the refusal to be diminished, and discovering that the people who were supposed to be proudest of what I had built had instead used it as a reason to resent me. The weight of being composed, of being the capable one, of being the woman who holds herself together so completely and so consistently that it has never once occurred to anyone in my life to ask whether the holding together is costing me something. I cried. I do not cry often. I am not, as a general disposition, a woman given to public or private emotional performance. But I cried on that bench on Parliament Hill on that grey November Sunday morning, quietly and completely and without audience, in the manner of someone releasing something that has been held under pressure for a very long time and has reached the limit of what pressure can contain. I did not hear the footsteps on the path behind me. The heath has its own acoustic, the wind through the remaining leaves, the distant voices of the joggers, the kite string sound above, and I was not listening for company because I had not expected any. The bench shifted slightly with added weight. Someone sat at the other end of it. A paper cup appeared in my peripheral vision, placed carefully on the bench beside me. I looked at it. Then I looked at the man who had placed it there. Aldous was sitting at the far end of the bench in a dark coat, his breath visible in the cold morning air, holding a second cup in both hands, with the patient equanimity of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to arrive and is in no hurry about what happens next. He did not say anything. He did not look at me with the particular expression that people deploy when they have found someone crying and want credit for their compassionate response. He simply sat, as he always sits, contained, unhurried, present in the complete and uncomplicated way that I had come to understand was simply his nature. I picked up the cup. It was coffee, still hot, black, no sugar, which was correct. I asked him how he knew I was here. He said, "Crispin mentioned once that you come to Hampstead when things are heavy. He said it the way people mention things they think are charming but haven't understood the meaning of." I asked him if he had remembered that. He said, "I remembered everything." We sat in silence for a while. The red kite above the slope continued its argument with the wind. The city spread itself below us in its grey November register, entirely indifferent and entirely magnificent. Then I began to talk. I told him about Brixton, about my father leaving when I was 7, and the particular quality of the silence his departure left in the house on Railton Road. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of a space that had been shaped around a presence, and now had to reshape itself around a void. About my mother's hands, folded on the kitchen table, and the 6 words she had chosen when I needed 12. I told him about Alongℹ, not the wedding, not the betrayal in its specific recent form, but the longer history of it. The childhood in which I had understood, through the accumulation of small and undeniable evidence, that my sister's resentment of me was not a choice she had made, but a conclusion she had arrived at. That I had spent years trying to be smaller, less visible, less obviously capable, in order to give her more room, and that the gesture had been received not as generosity, but as condescension. I told him about the rooms, the Mayfair offices, the client dinners, the gallery openings, the architectural award ceremonies where I collected 2 separate commendations in 2 separate years, and stood at the podium and thanked the people, required to be thanked, and returned to my flat on Effra Road alone and made myself dinner, and felt, underneath the genuine satisfaction of the achievement, the particular loneliness of having no one to come home to who had been waiting to hear how it went. He listened to all of it. He did not offer solutions. He did not reframe my experience in more optimistic language. He did not perform sympathy with the eager responsiveness of someone who wants to be seen, to be empathetic. He received everything I said with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, completely, carefully, as though what I was telling him was the most important information he had encountered, and he intended to treat it accordingly. After a long time, he said, "The thing that costs the most, I think, is being strong enough that no one ever thinks to ask." I looked at him. He said, "I should have asked earlier than this. I'm sorry that I didn't." I did not reply immediately. I looked at the city below us, at the Shard and the Dome, and the grey, sprawling immensity of the place that had made me and challenged me and occasionally tried to refuse me entry and had failed in that effort every single time. Then I said, "You're asking now?" He said, "Yes, I am." We stayed on that bench for 3 hours. The kite came down. The joggers thinned out. The dog with the urgent agenda reappeared with his 2 owners, better satisfied than before. The city below us continued its Sunday business without reference to anything we said. When we finally stood to walk back down toward the station, the path was empty in both directions, and the wind had dropped to almost nothing. Our hands were close as we walked. I was aware of this with a precision that had nothing to do with accident. Then I reached out and took his hand, not tentatively, deliberately. 2 full seconds of his hand in mine, the warmth of it in the cold morning, the solidness of it. Then I released it and walked on and said nothing about it. He said nothing either. but I felt the quality of his silence change beside me, and I understood that 2 seconds had been sufficient to alter the entire landscape of what we were to each other. We walked the rest of the way to Hampstead Station in the changed silence of 2 people who have crossed a threshold together and are taking their time about deciding what to do on the other side of it. Chapter 8. The Ledbury. 10 days after Hampstead Heath, Aldous asked me to dinner. He did not make a ceremony of the asking. He called me on a Wednesday evening while I was at my desk at Halcourt and Vane, reviewing the structural specifications for the Peckham housing project, and he said, in the direct, unhurried manner that I had come to understand was simply how he communicated when he had decided something, that he would like to take me to dinner on Saturday evening if I was available and willing. I said I was both. He said he would collect me at 7:30. I returned to the structural specifications and sat with a small, quiet thing in my chest that I did not examine too closely, because I was at my desk at work and some things deserve better surroundings than fluorescent office lighting for their examination. He arrived at 7:30 precisely. A black car, not ostentatious, simply good, pulled up outside the flat on Effra Road, and he was in it. And he got out when I appeared at the door and held the car door in the way that men of his generation and formation do, not as performance, but as the deeply ingrained habit of someone for whom certain courtesies are simply the texture of ordinary behavior rather than a statement about anything. I was wearing a dark green dress I had bought 2 years ago for a dinner I had ultimately not attended. It had been hanging in my wardrobe since, waiting for the correct occasion to justify its existence. I had looked at it on Saturday afternoon and thought, this is what it was waiting for. We drove north and west through the Saturday evening city, through Stockwell and Vauxhall, and along the embankment where the Thames caught the last of the November light, through Chelsea and into Notting Hill, the streets filling and then thinning again as we moved through the different registers of a London Saturday. The Ledbury is on Ledbury Road, at the corner where it meets Talbot Road, the quieter, residential northern end of the street, where the white stucco terraces stand in their Victorian rows with their iron railings and their well-maintained window boxes, and the general air of a neighbourhood that has arrived at its present condition through a combination of money and taste and considerable good fortune regarding postcode. The restaurant occupies a corner building that was once a pub. You can read it in the bones of the structure if you know what to look for, and has been transformed into something that retains the solidity of its origins while operating at a register entirely removed from them. Inside, the room is moody and warm, dark wood and textured walls, and earthy tones that suggest the natural world at one remove, distilled, refined, brought indoors without being domesticated. The tables are placed with the confidence of somewhere that does not need to maximize covers, because the quality of what happens at each table is the point, not the quantity of tables at which it happens. The ceilings are high enough to give the room air without making it cavernous. The lighting has been considered with the same seriousness that I bring to the lighting specifications in my own architectural work, which is to say, seriously. We were shown to our table near the window that faces Ledbury Road. We ordered without excessive deliberation. He knew the menu well enough to guide without directing, a quality I appreciate, the distinction between someone who shares knowledge and someone who deploys it as authority. We ordered wine, we settled, and then we talked in a way that we had not yet quite talked before, not the careful, weighted conversations of Claridge's, where we were both conscious of the gravity of what was being said and the gravity of what was being left unsaid, not the raw, unguarded exchange of Parliament Hill, where the cold and the height and the 2 weeks of accumulated pressure had stripped the conversational formalities down to something more essential. This was different. This was 2 people sitting across a table in a warm room on a Saturday evening with good food and good wine, and no immediate crisis to navigate, discovering what they were like in the absence of emergency. I told him about the Peckham housing project in more detail than I had allowed myself to discuss it with anyone outside the office. 42 units of genuinely affordable housing on a site 3 streets from where I grew up, designed around the people who would live there, rather than around the preferences of a developer who would never visit. Community consultation embedded in the process from the first drawing, green space integrated rather than appended. The kind of architecture that does not get photographed in the design magazines because its value is not visual but human, and human value is harder to frame. He listened to all of it with the complete unperformed attention that I had by now come to regard as one of his defining characteristics, the quality of someone for whom listening is not the pause between speaking but the primary activity. He told me about his father. Reginald Pemberton had built the Pemberton Group from a single logistics contract at Tilbury Docks in 1979, a contract obtained through a combination of expertise and the particular tenacity of a man who had grown up with very little and had decided early that very little was not his permanent condition. He had built the company over 30 years into something of genuine international scale, and he had done it with his attention focused so completely and so consistently on the building that almost nothing else in his life had received adequate attention, including his son. Aldous told me this without bitterness. He had processed his father's absences long ago, he said, had arrived somewhere in his 30s at an understanding of his father that was neither the idealization of childhood nor the resentment of adolescence, but something more adult and more complex. His father had loved him in the way that men of his particular formation love their children, entirely, but at a remove that made the entirety of it difficult to feel. When Reginald Pemberton died, Aldous was 31. He had spent the 2 years prior to his father's death completing the second year of his studies at the Architectural Association on Bedford Square, which he had begun at 29 after a decade of working in the financial side of the Pemberton Group in a capacity he had found meaningful, but not, in the deepest sense, his. He had left the AAA the week of his father's funeral. He had not returned. He said, there was no one else. The company needed someone who understood it from the inside. Refusing felt like a rejection of everything my father had spent his life building. So I accepted. I said, do you regret it? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then he said, I regret the timing of it. I do not regret the decision. The work has meaning. The scale of what the company does, the infrastructure, the logistics, the systems that keep things moving, has genuine significance in the world, and I would rather do significant work imperfectly than insignificant work well. He paused. Then he said, but I think about the Architectural Association sometimes. I said, I know. He looked at me. I said, I could tell. The first evening I met you at the Belgravia dinner, you were the only person in that room who looked at the proportions of the space rather than the people occupying it. I noticed it, and I didn't understand what I was noticing. Now I do. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically. He was not a man whose expressions moved dramatically, but something settled, as though a piece of information had arrived that he'd been waiting for without quite knowing he was waiting for it. We ate, we talked. The room around us continued its warm, unhurried Saturday evening, and we continued ours. And it was, I noted this with some precision because I am a person who notes things, entirely natural, not effortful, not the result of two people deciding to be comfortable together, simply comfortable, in the way that certain things are when they have been a long time arriving, and the arriving is therefore a relief rather than a novelty. At 10:30, my phone lit up on the table beside my plate. Lovett. I silenced it. The screen went dark. 30 seconds later it lit up again. Lovett. I silenced it a second time. Then a text message arrived. I glanced at the screen without meaning to. An involuntary reflex. The same reflex that makes you look toward a sudden sound, even when you have decided you are not interested in its source. The message was written entirely in capital letters. It said, "You are embarrassing yourself. He is using you to humiliate Crispin. Everyone is talking about it. Have some self-respect." I read it in approximately 3 seconds. I set the phone face down on the table. I looked at Aldous. He had seen my expression move. He waited. He did not ask, which was the correct instinct, waiting rather than prompting, giving me the space to decide what to do with what I had just read, rather than requiring me to perform a reaction for his benefit. I told him what the message said. I picked the phone up and read it aloud in a voice that was entirely level, because I had decided in the 3 seconds between reading it and setting the phone down that I was not going to allow my sister's fear, because that is what it was, fear dressed in aggression, as it had always been, to alter the temperature of this evening by a single degree. He listened to it without changing his expression. Then he said, "Do you believe it?" I said, "No, but I needed to hear myself say that out loud, in the presence of another person, to be certain." He said, "And are you certain?" I said, "Yes." I turned the phone off entirely. I placed it in my bag. I picked up my wine glass. He picked up his. We continued dinner. We did not speak about the message again that evening. It had been introduced, acknowledged, assessed, and dismissed, and neither of us saw value in its further examination when there were better things to talk about. We left the restaurant at 11:30. Ledbury Road at that hour on a Saturday was quiet in the manner of a residential Notting Hill street that has finished its evening and is settling into its night. The occasional couple walking, the warm light from a ground-floor window, the warmer Castle pub on the Lonsdale Road corner, releasing the last of its Saturday crowd into the cold air. We stood on the pavement outside the restaurant. I turned to face him. I had something to say, and I intended to say it clearly, because clarity has always been the mode I trust most in situations that matter. I said, "I need you to understand something before this goes any further. I'm not doing this to recover from Crispin. I am not filling a vacancy in my life with the nearest available person. I am not using you as a means of demonstrating anything to anyone in that wedding reception or outside it. If I am here with you on this pavement, it is because I have decided independently and on my own terms that I want to be. And I need you to understand that distinction, because I will not be anyone's consolation and I will not be anyone's statement. I have been both of those things for other people for too long." He looked at me for a moment in the cold Notting Hill air. Then he said, "I have been waiting 4 years for you to make a decision for entirely your own reasons. The decision you have just described is the only kind I'm interested in." I held his gaze. Then I said, "Good." I turned toward the car he had arranged, which was waiting 20 meters along the street. And then I stopped, because Livette was sitting on the steps outside the entrance to my building on Effra Road. I did not know this yet, but I would discover it 40 minutes later when the car turned onto my street and the headlights swept the pavement, and there she was, in a coat I recognized, sitting on my front steps, with the rigid posture of a woman who has been sitting in the cold for some time and has decided that whatever she came to say is worth the temperature. She stood up when she saw the car. She looked at me as I got out. She said, "We need to talk. Tonight." Chapter 9. Dorothea's Confession. I did not let Livette inside. This was a decision I made in the 2 seconds between stepping out of the car and reaching the pavement, before she had finished her sentence. Not from cruelty. I want to be precise about that, because cruelty has never been my instrument, and on that particular evening, standing on Effra Road at 20 minutes past midnight in the cold, with my sister's eyes on me, I was not feeling cruel. I was feeling something quieter and more considered than cruelty. I was feeling the particular clarity that arrives sometimes when you have spent a very long evening in the company of someone honest, and you find that the honesty has recalibrated your tolerance for its opposite. Levette inside my flat meant Levette in my space. In the rooms I had made for myself, the books arranged on the shelves in the order I placed them, the drawings pinned above the desk in the corner, the Jamaican rum on the kitchen counter above the second drawer, which is where my mother kept hers and where I keep mine, not because I planned it, but because some arrangements simply inherit themselves. Levette inside my flat meant her voice in rooms that had been, until that moment, free of it. I was not prepared to offer that, so we stood on the steps in the cold. She was wearing a camel-colored coat I had seen before. She had bought it 2 winters ago with money I suspected she did not quite have, because Levette has always spent toward the life she intends to inhabit rather than the one she currently occupies, which is a tendency I understand even when I cannot endorse it. She looked at me and I looked at her, and for a moment neither of us said anything. In the silence, I saw my sister clearly. Not the version of her that the wedding had presented in white and triumph and the performance of arrival, but the version that existed beneath the performance. She was 30 years old and she was tired, and the tiredness was not the tiredness of a late November Saturday, but something older and more structural. The tiredness of a woman who has been at war for a very long time and has begun, somewhere beneath the combativeness, to question whether the war was worth its cost. She spoke first. She said, "I know you're angry." I said, "I'm not angry, Levette." This was true. What I felt, standing on those steps, was not anger, but the residue of it, the cooled and clarified substance that anger leaves behind when it has burned through its own fuel, which is sadder and heavier and more useful for understanding than the hot version. She said, "Then what are you?" I said, "Tired and listening, if you have something to say." She pulled her coat tighter. The Ephra Road night moved around us. A bus at the far end of the street, its headlights sweeping the corner as it turned, the distant sound of voices from somewhere on the parallel street, the ordinary, indifferent machinery of South London on a Saturday night. She said, "I did it deliberately." I had known this. I had known it for 8 months with the certainty of someone who understands the person they are talking about, who has been studying them, involuntarily and with mixed feelings, for the entirety of their shared life. But hearing it said aloud in Levette's own voice, on my front steps in the cold, was different from knowing it. Knowing it had been a private reckoning. Hearing it was something else. I said, "I know." She said, "I went to Crispin's flat that night because I wanted something you had. Not because I loved him, not then. I thought, if she has this and I take it, then I have something she had, and maybe that means I am—" She stopped. I waited. She said, "I don't know what I thought it meant. I thought it would feel like something, like an equalizing." I looked at my sister, at her face in the yellow light of the Ephra Road street lamp, which is not a flattering light. It strips everything back to its essentials and shows you the structure beneath the surface without the softening that better lighting provides. What I saw in her face was not the triumphant woman of the wedding reception. It was not the sharp, defensive woman of a lifetime of competition. It was someone younger and more frightened, standing inside a life she had seized before she had understood its full dimensions, only now beginning to understand them. I said, "Was it worth it?" She was quiet for a long time. The bus at the far end of the street had gone. Ephra Road had settled back into its late-night quiet. A fox, the urban kind, lean and unapologetic, appeared on the pavement 30 meters away, considered us briefly, and continued about its business with the magnificent indifference of an animal entirely at home in its own world. Levette said, "I don't know yet." These 4 words were the most honest thing my sister had said to me in years, possibly in our adult lives. She did not claim happiness. She did not defend the decision. She did not perform the contentment that the wedding and the speeches and the white dress had been performing on her behalf. She simply admitted that she did not yet know whether the thing she had done was worth what it had cost, which was, in its way, the beginning of an accounting that had been a very long time coming. It did not undo what she had done. I want to be clear about that. Understanding is not absolution. Honesty after the fact does not restore what dishonesty destroyed. But it was real, and I have always found it easier to be in a room or on a step with something real than with the polished, defended alternative. I said, "Go home, Alongℹ." She looked at me. For a moment I thought she was going to say something more, to push further, to produce the argument she had perhaps rehearsed on the bus or the tube ride to Effra Road. But she didn't. She simply looked at me for a long moment, and then she nodded, and then she turned and walked back up the street in her camel-colored coat, and I watched her until she reached the corner and turned and was gone. I went inside. I made tea. I stood in my kitchen and drank it slowly, and thought about what she had said, and what she had not said, and what the distance was between those two things, and whether it was possible in time to build something across that distance that was neither the old war nor a false peace. I did not have an answer that night. I was not certain I would have one for some time. The following morning, a Sunday, grey and cold in the particular way of a London November Sunday that has decided it is entirely serious about winter, I took the Victoria line to Brixton and walked to Railton Road. The blue door. I stood outside it for a moment before I knocked. I looked at the paint, peeling at the lower left corner where the wood has always been slightly damp. The colour faded in the way that colours fade in English weather, by degrees and over time, until the original is still visible beneath the alteration, but has become a ghost of itself rather than the living thing it was. I knocked. Dorothea opened the door. She looked at my face, and she stepped back immediately without a word, and I came in. The house smelled the way it always smells. The kitchen was warm. The radio on the counter was playing something I did not immediately identify, a Sunday morning program, voices talking at low volume about something that was not the interior of our lives. My mother turned the radio off. She sat down at the kitchen table. I sat across from her. The pine table with the ring mark on the left side from a mug placed without a coaster sometime in the mid-90s, which I have looked at from this chair more times than I could count, and which has always seemed to me like the perfect emblem of this family. The mark left by something warm, set down without care, permanent regardless of whether anyone intended it to be. Dorothea folded her hands on the table. She looked at them. Then she looked at me, and then she spoke. Not in the careful, rationed way she usually speaks, word by word, with the precision of a woman who has learned to give very little away because the things she has given away in her life have not always been returned intact. She spoke the way people speak when they have arrived at the end of a long internal argument and have finally resolved it in favor of the truth. She said, "I loved both of you. I need you to know that before I say the rest, because the rest will sound like the opposite of it, and it is not." I said, "I know you loved us both." She said, "But I showed it wrong, from the beginning, from before Alongℹ could understand what she was being shown, and before you were old enough to understand what you were being denied." She paused. She looked at her hands. She said, "Your sister's complexion, the way she looked, it was closer to what I had imagined, before you were both born, before I understood that imagining was the wrong way to love something that hadn't arrived yet. She looked like the photographs in my head. You looked like your father, and your father left. And something in me, something I am ashamed of and have been ashamed of for 30 years, treated those two things as connected, as though you had done something by looking the way you look, as though Alongℹ deserved more of me because she cost me less to look at." She stopped speaking. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Railton Road made its Sunday morning sounds, soft, intermittent, the neighborhood breathing rather than performing. My mother said, "I watched you build yourself from nothing. I watched you study at this table and get your degree and take that job and become the person you are. And instead of feeling proud, and I did feel proud, Seraphine, I need you to know I felt proud. I have always been proud. I felt guilty. Because your strength was an indictment of my failure. Every time you achieved something without my help, it reminded me that you had achieved it without my help. And I didn't know how to be proud and ashamed at the same time, so I showed you very little of either." She looked up from her hands. Her eyes were wet. My mother does not cry easily. The cost of the crying was visible in her face. She said, "You raised yourself. I should have raised you, and I am deeply, genuinely sorry that I didn't." I sat with this. I sat with it the way I sit with a structural problem, giving it the time and the silence it requires, not rushing to a resolution before I have understood the full dimensions of what I am working with. Then I reached across the pine table with the ring mark from the mid-90s, and I took my mother's hands in mine. I did not say, "It's fine." It was not fine. It had not been fine for 36 years, and pretending otherwise would have been a disservice to both of us and to everything she had just had the courage to say. I said, "I hear you, and I needed you to say it. I have needed you to say it for a very long time." She held my hands, and she cried properly, quietly, the way daily women cry, without spectacle, with considerable thoroughness. I did not cry. I had done my crying on Parliament Hill. What I felt now was something different from grief, something closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you have been carrying for so long that you had stopped noticing it as a weight and had begun to regard it as simply the normal condition of being upright. We sat at the table for an hour. We drank tea. We did not resolve everything. Some things between a mother and her daughter take longer than a Sunday morning kitchen conversation to fully resolve, and I am old enough and clear-eyed enough to understand that. But we named what needed naming, and we held what needed holding, and when I stood up to leave, I was not the same person who had knocked on the blue door an hour earlier. I walked back to Brixton Station in the grey November morning. Outside the station entrance, on the busy Brixton Road with its Saturday market still setting up its last stalls, and the buses moving north and south in their implacable weekend rhythm, I stopped walking. I took my phone from my coat pocket. I found Aldous in my recent calls. I pressed the number. He answered on the second ring. I said, "I'm ready, for all of it. I wanted you to know." There was a brief silence, the kind that is not empty but full, the kind that contains a response that does not need to be spoken immediately because the person on the other end of the line has understood and is simply allowing themselves to understand it completely before they reply. Then he said, "Tell me where you are, I'll come." I said, "No, not yet. I just wanted you to know." He said, "I know." I said, "Good." I ended the call. I stood on Brixton Road in the grey morning with the market noise around me and the buses moving and the ordinary magnificent life of this neighbourhood proceeding in every direction at once, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like someone standing at the beginning of something rather than the end of it. Chapter 10. London Bridge. I asked him to meet me on London Bridge, not a restaurant, not Claridge's with its fumoir and its black marble bar and its Lalique light, not his townhouse in Eaton Square, which I had still not seen, and which I was in no hurry to see, because I had learned something important about myself in the past 3 weeks, and it was this. I did not want the trappings of his world to be present in the room when we said the things we were going to say. I wanted concrete and river wind and the ordinary, unadorned infrastructure of a city that had made us both in its different ways and had asked nothing of us in return except that we be equal to it. London Bridge at midnight is not what visitors to this city imagine when they hear the name. I want to be clear about this because the city I know is not the city of postcards and tourist itineraries, and this moment deserved the real London, not the imagined one. London Bridge is not the Gothic tower and drawbridge structure that most people picture. That is Tower Bridge, half a mile downstream, which is extraordinary and knows it. London Bridge is the 1973 concrete and Portland stone crossing, 3 spans, 6 lanes, functional and deliberate and entirely without pretension. It says, "I am here to do a job, and I am doing it." I have always found more beauty in that kind of honesty than in ornamentation. At midnight on a Thursday in late November, it was almost empty. The daytime bridge, the one that carries 20,000 vehicles and a river of commuters between the city and London Bridge station in the peak hours, loud and purposeful and indifferent to everything except forward movement, had retired for the evening and left this quieter, stranger version in its place. A handful of pedestrians moving with the quick, head-down purpose of people who are crossing rather than pausing. The wind off the Thames, which at that height and at that hour had a sharpness to it that the surrounding streets withheld. The lights of the illuminated river scheme running the length of the crossing in warm amber tones, their reflection moving on the dark water below in the particular irregular way of light on a tidal river, not the steady shimmer of still water, but something more alive and less predictable. And downstream, exactly where it should be, Tower Bridge. Lit against the November dark, its Victorian Gothic towers rising above the Pool of London with the unapologetic magnificence of a structure that was built to inspire awe and has been doing so without interruption for over 130 years. From London Bridge at night, Tower Bridge is framed like a painting. The dark river in the foreground, HMS Belfast moored on the south bank, the Shard rising above the Southwark skyline to the left, and Tower Bridge itself in the centre of the composition, lit and reflected and entirely, incontestably itself. I arrived first and stood at the southern railing. I had been standing there for perhaps 8 minutes when I heard his footsteps on the bridge behind me. Unhurried, deliberate, the particular rhythm of a man who is walking towards something he has decided to walk toward and is not reconsidering the decision mid-stride. He came and stood beside me at the railing. He looked downstream at Tower Bridge the way he always looks at things worth looking at, with full attention, without performance. He said, "You chose well," I said. "I usually do." We stood for a moment in the cold and the amber light and the sound of the river moving below us, which is not a gentle sound at that hour. The Thames at a London bridge at night carries the weight of tides and history and the immense quiet authority of water that has been moving through this city for longer than the city has existed to name it. Then I turned away from the view. I faced him. I said, "I need to say something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." He turned from the railing. He faced me. He put his hands in his coat pockets, and he gave me the complete, unhurried attention that I had come to regard as one of the most valuable things about him. The quality of someone for whom listening is not an obligation, but a genuine act. I said, "You loved me in silence for 4 years. I understand why you did it. I understand the reasoning, and I understand the honesty it took to tell me the reasoning without dressing it in more flattering language. But I need you to understand that the silence was its own kind of wound. Not the deepest, not the most deliberate, but real and present, and something that I have had to account for in deciding how I feel about where we are." He did not move. He held my gaze. I said, "I was in a room with you for 3 years, and you said nothing. You watched something happen to me. You knew, before it happened, that it was going to happen. And you made a decision based on your own moral reasoning that left me without information I deserved to have. I'm not saying your reasoning was wrong. I'm saying that the consequence of it fell on me, and I need you to hold that without defending yourself before I tell you what comes next." He said, "I hold it." No qualification, no explanation appended. 2 words, spoken with the directness of a man who has already held it, who has been holding it, I suspected, for considerably longer than this conversation. I said, "What comes next is this." I paused. The river moved below us. The amber light ran the length of the bridge, and Tower Bridge stood downstream in its magnificent, illuminated certainty, and the wind came off the Thames with the cold authority of late November, and I stood on a concrete bridge in the city that had made me, and I said the thing I had come here to say. I said, "I am not here because I am recovering from Crispin Harwood. I am not here because you intervened at a reception and said something kind in front of a room that needed to hear it. I am not here because you brought coffee to a bench on Parliament Hill, or because you sat beside me in a church pew at the precise moment I needed someone to sit beside me. Those things matter. They tell me who you are, but they are not why I am here." I said, "I am here because in the past 3 weeks I have sat across a table from you and listened to you speak about your father and your work, and the life you constructed from what you were given, and the life you set aside because someone else needed what you had built, and I have recognized in that something I understand from the inside. I am here because you listen the way very few people listen, not waiting, not preparing, but actually receiving. I am here because you are the only person in my recent life who has sat beside me in my grief without trying to fix it or reframe it or make it about their own capacity for compassion." I said, "And I am here because I am 36 years old, and I have spent a significant portion of those years building things for other people. My mother's image of who I should be, my profession's requirements, Crispin's idea of a suitable partner, my sister's opposite, and I have decided that the next thing I build for myself. And I think you might be part of that. If you are willing to be part of it on my terms, which are not negotiable, and which you have, I believe, already demonstrated that you understand." I stopped speaking. The bridge held us in its amber light. The wind came off the river. Somewhere below, the dark Thames moved toward the sea with the patient, comprehensive indifference of something that has been doing this since before any of us arrived and will continue doing it long after all of us are gone, which I find, on balance, more comforting than otherwise. Aldous was quiet for a moment, not the uncomfortable quiet of a man assembling a response, the quiet of a man who has heard something important and is giving it the full weight of his attention before he responds, because the thing he has heard deserves that weight and he knows it. Then he said, "May I speak now?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I have rehearsed various versions of this conversation in my head for 8 months. I discarded all of them this afternoon because I decided that if I arrived on this bridge with prepared language, I would be serving myself rather than you, and I am done serving myself in situations that concern you." He said, "What I want to tell you is not complicated. It is simply true, and I will tell it plainly." He said, "I noticed you on the evening of a dinner party in Belgravia 4 years ago. Not your appearance, though you were, and are, remarkable to look at, but the way you engaged with the world. You said something about a concrete walkway on the South Bank, with the specificity and the conviction of someone who has looked at the world with more care than most people are capable of, and I thought, that is someone who sees things differently. I thought, I would like to spend the rest of my life in proximity to that way of seeing." He said, "I did nothing about it because you were with my oldest friend, and I am not a man who does that. I told myself the restraint was honorable. I still believe it was. But I also know, as you have told me, and as I knew before you told me, that the restraint had a cost, and the cost was paid by you and not by me, and that is not something I can reframe as virtue. I can only carry it correctly going forward. He said, I am not asking you for a version of what you had with Crispin. I am not a replacement, and I have no interest in being one. What I am asking for, if you are willing to give it, is the chance to be present in your life in a way that is entirely its own thing. New, built from scratch, on ground that belongs to both of us, with no prior architecture to constrain it. He paused. Then he said, You said the next thing you build for yourself. I would like to be part of that construction. I am a patient man, and I am a thorough one, and I have, as you know, been waiting a considerable time already. I can wait longer if that is what you need. But I wanted you to know that the offer is there, and it is genuine, and it is not going anywhere. I looked at him. I looked at him for a long moment on London Bridge in the cold and the amber light, with Tower Bridge downstream, and the Thames below, and the city around us in its vast, indifferent, magnificent entirety. I thought about Brixton, about the kitchen table with the ring mark from the mid-90s, about my mother's hands, folded and then opened, about Livette on the steps in her camel coat saying, I don't know yet, with the honesty of someone who has finally stopped pretending, about a bench on Parliament Hill and a coffee cup placed without ceremony and 2 seconds of a warm hand in the cold morning. I thought about the girl who used to ride the bus from Brixton and look at the London skyline through the window and wonder what those lights were for, and whether they would ever be for someone who looked like her and came from where she came from. I did not rush. I have never rushed anything that mattered. I said, I am not giving you 3 years to discover what I am worth. You already know what I am worth. I have watched you know it for the better part of an hour on a concrete bridge in November, and it is not a question I intend to revisit. He said, It is not a question I have ever needed to revisit. I said, Then we understand each other. He said, We have always understood each other. We were simply waiting for the correct moment to admit it. I stepped toward him. He did not move toward me. He waited, still, patient, present, because he understood that this was mine to initiate, mine to cross, mine to arrive at in my own time and on my own terms. He had understood that from the beginning. It was, in the end, one of the most important things about him. I took his face in both my hands, the way you take hold of something you have decided belongs to you. And I kissed him. On London Bridge, in the amber light, with the Thames moving beneath us and Tower Bridge lit downstream, and the city extending itself in every direction around us in all its complicated, demanding, extraordinary life. I kissed him first, because I decide things for entirely my own reasons, because I have always decided things for entirely my own reasons, and because after 36 years of building and surviving and refusing to be diminished, I had finally arrived at a life that was entirely, unreservedly mine. The river moved below us. The city held its noise around us. The lights ran the length of the bridge in warm amber, and their reflections moved on the dark water below in the alive, irregular, unpredictable way of light on something that cannot be stilled. I thought, I grew up watching those lights from a bus window, wondering if they were for me. They were. They always were. I simply had to survive long enough, and build long enough, and refuse to be broken long enough to come and stand inside them. And here I was, standing inside them at last.